Welcome to this tutorial. My name is Ian and I'm going to be taking you through the tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at how you can quickly change the method that you're using for aggregation within your pivot tables. So if you've ever used Excel and you've used equals average or equals min or equals max, we're going to be doing exactly the same using pivot tables. However, you're going to see there's no formulas involved, we're just going to select the function. So basically we're going to be looking at how we can get our average, how we can get a min, a max, a count, very easily with our pivot tables. Please note that this is part of a series of tutorials, so please look out for the other tutorials. Also, please make sure you like and subscribe the channel to keep up to date with all our latest tutorials. Having said all of that, let's jump into the tutorial. I will see you there. Welcome to this tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to continue to use our online Excel. So just remember, we're working in our browser, so hopefully anybody with an Apple, a Chromebook, or a Windows machine can all be looking at the same version of Excel. So we're going to continue to use our pivot table that we've been using. Now, if you haven't done the previous tutorials, I would suggest please start at tutorial number 1 for the online Excel. It'll just show you where we started with the data source, how we converted it into a pivot table, and then also how we created some simple pivot tables from that. However, in this tutorial, we're going to be looking at something called different methods of aggregation. Now, what you're going to see with your pivot tables is that when you use them, you will default to summing as your default method of aggregation. So let's look at an example of that. Let's say we got our product subcategories, and we're going to drop that into our rows, and let's take our sales figures. Now, when you drop your sales figures in there, you will automatically get your sum of sales. Just remember, if you want to format these values, just highlight all of the values that are in the pivot table, go across to your home menu, go to your number formatting. In this case, I'm using my comma, so you get my thousand separator, and then I am removing my decimals just by using the remove decimals. Okay, so that's just a quick way of being able to format your numbers within your pivot table. Okay, as I said though, what you've seen by default is that we get the sum of sales. So basically it goes through the data source, and if we go back to this data, remember that we started off with all this data. We have all these individual sales values. There's about 8,400 rows in this data source. And basically it's just adding up all of those sales values. Okay, so go back to our pivot table on sheet 1. So we got the sum of sales. But what happens if you want to change this now? If you wanted to know what was my average sale? So with the average sale, what it will do is it will total your sales and then divide it by the number of transactions. That's really easy to be able to do in our pivot tables. So what you do is you just go to one of the values that are in your pivot table and you right click. And you'll see on the right click that you get something called summarize values by. So this gives you the ability to be able to change how the calculations are done. And you'll see that the top ones are the ones we're going to focus on. So we're going to look at count, average, max, min. We're going to look at those ones. Further down, you do get some statistical values that you can use as well. I'm going to leave you to experiment with those. But let's start with average. So I click on average, and you'll see immediately that basically this will be recalculated to show the average sales value for each product subcategory. So as I said, it's taking total sales, dividing it by the number of transactions. And really as easy as that, you're just picking basically average. What if you wanted to know what the highest sales value was? So basically what you're doing there is, if we go back to our data source, we go back to data here, it will go through your sales, and for each product subcategory, it would pick out the individual highest value that is within your sales. So this is called our max, and in Excel, if you've ever used equals max, it's basically doing exactly the same thing. So let's go back to our sheet, and let's right click on this, and we're going to go back to summarize values by, and we're going to use max. So you'll see now that we get the highest individual sales value. Now we can do the opposite. We could get the lowest individual sales value, and this won't surprise you. We can just go to min, and that will look for the lowest individual value. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that you will see that the grand total, when you're using an average or a max or a min, it changes what it's doing. So basically with the grand total for an average, it's showing you the average for the entire data source. If you're doing a max, it's showing the highest value within the entire data source. If it's a min, it will show you the lowest value within the data source. So just be aware that that's what your grand total is showing you. Basically, at the moment, this is showing me that the lowest value is actually 2. So there we go. We've now got our min of sales being shown here. Okay, there is one other we cover, which is called count. And what that does is it goes through and it counts the number of rows with us within the product subcategory. So if we go back into our data sheet here, and we looked at our product subcategory. If we took this first one, storage and organization, what it would do is it would go through for storage and organization and count the number of times that this is there. So go along and it would then find the next one that is in here, and it would go, okay, that's the second one. And it would go down and go, that's the third one. So basically it's just doing a count. So when you're doing a count, it doesn't really matter which field you're using the count for, you will always get the same results. So again, we can just right click on this, summarize values by, and we can go to our count, and that will then give us a count of the number of transactions that are within the data source. Now you'll see that we get a total of 8,399 rows in this data source. Now those of you who have done the first tutorial will know there's 8,400 rows, but please remember there's one header row, which has got our field names. So basically we've got 8,399 rows of data and one header row. So that's why that is the way it is. Okay, so great. We've seen that it's very easy to be able to change these methods of calculation, and you can do it on each field. But what if you wanted to have one table and you wanted to be able to display all of those methods? Well, we can easily do that. So what we're going to do, let's just take our sales for our product subcategories, and we're just going to change this back to our sum. We'll get our default sum values there. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to add another sales value. So we just add another sales value in here. As you can see, I just drag it across to my values, drop it in there, and then it will create a new sales value. And you'll see, obviously, because it's summing up the sales, it gives me exactly the same values as I've got in the first column. But what I can do is I can go across to this, just right click on it, and we can now tell this that we want to see this as a average. And there we go, we've now got our average sales. And I can continue to repeat this. So basically go across, drop another sales value in there. And now let's say we want to make this to be our max. Again, just right click, summarize values by, go to our max. And you'll see now that this will then update that to the max sales. So as you can see as well, that we're getting these column names. Now these may not be the best ones when you're trying to present this to your colleagues. You can actually change these. Now as long as you're not using a name that is a field within your pivot tables, it'll let you work. So instead of sum of sales, let's say we wanted to say this is my total sales value. Instead of average of sales written like that, let's just say this is my average sales. Instead of max of sales, let's just say this is my highest sale. So you can see I'm just typing this over the cell, press enter, accept it, and that's changed the name of the header. Makes it much easier to see. Okay, we're going to add two more. We're just going to add another sales value. And in this case, we'll get the min sales value. And let's just change that to a min. So again, right click on this. I'm going to say summarize values by min. And we can change the header. And we'll say that that is our lowest sale. Now, as I said, it doesn't really matter when you're doing a count as to which field you're using. But if you wanted to, you could use another field. So let's say we just dragged our order ID in there, dropped our order ID in there. Now you can see by default it summed it. Okay, so we've got the sum of all the order IDs. So I'm just going to say we're going to change that to summarize values by, and we're going to tell this to be a count. And you'll see now do a count of all the number of transactions. And I can just call this my number of transactions. Now you can go ahead and you can format this. You could change your column widths if you wanted to. Can actually change the formatting as well if you want to play around with that. The other thing to remember is you can change the rows. So if I take our product subcategory now, and let's say we put in our customer state, you'll see that the calculation will now be updated to calculate all those calculations for my customer states. So this is extremely powerful. Hopefully you've seen how it can easily change from a sum to an average to a max to a min to a count using your pivot tables. I'm going to conclude this tutorial here, but I hope to see you in all the other tutorials.